Imagine a sound so rhythmic and deafening that it shakes the earth beneath your feet. It is not the rumble of thunder, but the march of 10,000 men. The air is thick with the metallic tang of iron and the acrid smell of leather sweat. Before you lies a horizon of steel, a wall of shields moving in perfect synchronization, like a single, breathing organism. These are the legions of Rome, the most efficient killing machine the ancient world ever produced. They were the engine that drove a small city-state to dominate the entire Mediterranean basin. But this power came at a terrible cost. It was built on strict discipline, endless marching, and the cold, hard reality that for Rome to survive, her enemies had to die. Welcome to Legions of Rome: War, Conquest, and Glory. I am your host, Alex. In this series, we are going to strip away the myths and look at the reality of the Roman war machine. We will walk the dusty roads of Gaul, stand in the shadow of the siege walls of Alesia, and feel the tension in the ranks before the first pilum is thrown. This is the story of the men who conquered the world, not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most organized. If you are ready to march with the legions, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us bring these epic histories to life. Before we step onto the battlefield, I want to ask you a question. When you think of the Roman Empire, what is the first image that comes to mind? Is it the brilliance of a gladiator in the arena, or perhaps the sheer discipline of a marching legion? Let us know in the comments below. The history of Rome is written in blood, but it was organized by ink and iron. It is a story of tactical genius that is still studied in military academies today. From the early days of the citizen militia to the professional soldiers of the empire, the evolution of the legion is a mirror of Rome itself. So, tighten your sandals and check your gear. The campaign begins now. The story of the Roman legion does not begin with an empire, but with a small farming community struggling to survive in central Italy. In the early centuries of Rome, there was no professional army. Every male citizen who could afford it was required to fight. This was the hoplite phalanx, a formation borrowed from the Greeks. Imagine a solid block of spearmen, heavy and slow, moving as one unit across the field. It was effective on flat ground, but Italy is a land of hills, forests, and rough terrain. The phalanx was too rigid. It was a hammer, but Rome needed a sword. Faced with fierce enemies like the Samnites in the rugged mountains, the Romans realized they needed to change. They broke the phalanx apart and created a new system known as the manipular formation. This was a revolution in military strategy. Instead of one giant block, the army was divided into smaller units called maniples, consisting of roughly 120 men. These maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern. This allowed the army to move over uneven ground with flexibility that their enemies could not match. The soldiers were divided by age and experience. The youngest and least wealthy, the hastati, formed the front line. Behind them stood the principes, men in their prime, the heavy infantry of the army. At the rear were the triarii, the veterans, the old guard who would only be called upon if the battle was going badly. A Roman saying became famous at the time, "It has come to the triarii," meaning that the situation was desperate. This structure gave the Roman army a unique resilience. The young hastati would throw their javelins, known as pila, and engage the enemy, wearing them down. If they faltered, they could retreat through the gaps in the checkerboard formation without disrupting the entire line. Then, the fresh principes would step forward to take their place. It was a system of relays of violence, a constant pressure that few enemies could withstand. But the true turning point in the history of the legion came with the Punic Wars against Carthage. This was a conflict of survival. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca brought Rome to its knees, annihilating entire Roman armies in single battles. At the Battle of Cannae, 50,000 Romans died. It was a catastrophe. The old system of the citizen soldier, who had to return to his farm to harvest the crops, was no longer sufficient for a war that spanned decades and continents. To save Rome, a general named Marius made a radical change. He opened the army to the landless poor, the capitae censi, or head count. This was the birth of the professional legionary. For the first time, a Roman soldier did not need to own property to serve. The state would provide his weapons, his armor, and crucially, his pay. In return, the soldiers signed up for 25 years of service. This loyalty shifted from the state of Rome to the general who paid them and promised them land upon retirement. This change would eventually lead to the fall of the Republic, but first, it would create the greatest fighting force in history. With this professionalization came standardization. Every soldier carried the same load. They became famous as Marius's mules. They carried roughly 60 pounds of gear on their backs. This included their gladius, the short Spanish sword that was their primary weapon, their pilum, a shield called a scutum, 2 weeks of rations, a cooking pot, and a stake for fortifying their camp at night. They learned to build a marching camp every single afternoon when they stopped. No matter how tired they were, no matter how close the enemy was, they dug a ditch and built a rampart. This discipline meant that the Romans were never caught unawares. They slept in fortifications every night of their lives, a practice that gave them a massive psychological advantage over their enemies. The training was brutal. New recruits were given wooden swords and wicker shields that were twice as heavy as the real ones. They drilled until their arms felt like lead. They practiced against wooden stakes, thrusting overhand and overhand again, aiming for the face or the belly of the enemy. They did not need to learn how to slash. They needed to learn how to stab with lethal precision. The gladius was a thrusting weapon, designed to puncture armor and organs with minimal effort. This training created a muscle memory that took over in the heat of battle. When the shield wall collided with the enemy, a Roman soldier did not panic. He did not swing wildly, he thrust. He stepped forward into the kill zone, protected by his massive shield, and drove his point home. Then he did it again. This rhythmic, relentless stabbing was the terror of the ancient world. It turned warfare from a chaotic brawl into a grim industrial process. But the legion was more than just heavy infantry. It was a combined arms task force. Attached to each legion were specialized units. There were the velites, light skirmishers who harassed the enemy with javelins before the main lines met. There was the cavalry, drawn from the wealthier citizens or allied horsemen. While the Roman cavalry was never their strongest asset, their reliance on allied cavalry from places like Numidia in North Africa or Gaul helped balance their forces. The command structure was equally refined. At the head was the legate, a senator or general appointed by the Senate or the emperor. Beneath him were 6 tribunes, young officers often gaining experience for a political career. But the heart and soul of the legion were the centurions. These were the men who had risen from the ranks. They were the sergeants and the captains combined. They led from the front, wore transverse crests on their helmets so they could be seen, and carried a vine stick called a vetus to beat discipline into their men. A good centurion could make or break a legion. They were tough, experienced, and the glue that held the army together. As the Republic transformed into the empire under Augustus, the legions became a permanent fixture on the frontiers. The empire became a ring of iron, with legions stationed along the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates. They built permanent forts, many of which would grow into modern cities. These forts were self-contained communities, with baths, hospitals, and barracks. The soldiers lived a life of routine: guard duty, weapons practice, construction work, and constant readiness. The discipline in these forts was severe. The Romans believed that fear of punishment was as important as the desire for glory. There was a punishment called decimation. If a unit was found guilty of cowardice or mutiny, every 10th man was selected by lot and beaten to death by his 9 comrades. It was a horrific practice, reserved for the most serious offenses, but it ensured that the fear of failing your brothers in arms was greater than the fear of the enemy. This lifestyle created a culture of distinct identity. The soldier was no longer a farmer, he was a Miles, a soldier. He wore his uniform with pride. His armor was often decorated with awards for bravery. The phalarii were medallions worn on the chest, like medals, depicting busts of emperors or gods. To receive one was the highest honor. It meant you had stood your ground when others ran. We want to take a moment to pause and hear from you. The lifestyle of a Roman legionary was grueling, often involving marching 20 miles a day and building forts at night. Do you think you would have survived the training and discipline of a Roman legionary? Let us know in the comments if you think you have what it takes. Now, let us look at how this machine was deployed on the battlefield. The Romans were not always the strongest warriors man for man. A Gaulish barbarian might be taller and stronger than a Roman. A Parthian horseman might have been a better archer, but the Romans won because they fought as a unit. The primary battle formation was the triple line, retaining the spirit of the old manipular system, but now grouped into larger cohorts of roughly 480 men. A legion consisted of 10 cohorts. When the enemy approached, the Romans would advance until they were within throwing distance of their pila. The order to throw would be given, and thousands of heavy javelins would arc through the air. The pilum was a masterpiece of engineering. It had a soft iron shank that would bend upon impact. If it hit a shield, it would bury itself deep and flop over, making the shield impossible to use. The enemy was often forced to discard their shield, leaving them vulnerable. Then, the Romans would charge. The collision was terrifying. The sheer momentum of the Romans, carrying large shields, was intended to knock the enemy off balance. Once the lines were engaged, the Romans used their shorter swords to great effect inside the crush of bodies. The enemy's longer weapons became useless in the tight melee. If the enemy tried to flank them, the Romans could simply turn the rear cohort to face the new threat, forming a hollow square, an orbis, that could defend itself from all sides. It was this tactical flexibility that made the legions so effective against a wide variety of opponents. But warfare was not just about open battles. It was also about the slow, crushing pressure of a siege. This was where Roman engineering truly shone. The Romans understood that while you could defeat an army in a day, taking a fortified city required months or years of hard work. They were the masters of siege warfare. During the Jewish revolt in Judea, the Romans laid siege to the fortress of Masada. It was a mountaintop stronghold, seemingly impregnable. The legions did not retreat. They built a massive ramp of earth and stone against the side of the mountain, hauling the dirt up by hand, push a massive siege tower closer to the walls every day. The tower was armored with iron plates to protect against fire and arrows. Inside were battering rams designed to smash the gates. They also built ballistae and onagers, massive torsion-powered catapults. The ballista was like a giant crossbow, firing heavy iron-tipped bolts that could pin a man to a wall. The onager was a single-arm catapult that hurled massive stones to smash through fortifications. These machines required complex mathematical calculations for trajectory and tension, skills possessed by the Army's engineers, who were highly educated specialists. This engineering prowess extended to their most famous construction, the roads. The saying goes that all roads lead to Rome, and it was true. These roads were built for the military. They allowed legions to march from one end of the empire to the other with incredible speed. The roads were built in layers, a foundation of large stones, covered by smaller gravel, and finally capped with polygonal paving stones. They were cambered to allow water to run off, with ditches on the sides for drainage. A Roman legion could march 20 miles in 5 hours, arriving at a battle fresh and supplied because of this infrastructure. This strategic mobility meant that enemies could rarely outrun the Romans. If a rebellion started in one province, legions from neighboring provinces could converge on the rebels within weeks. The Roman navy also played a crucial role, especially during the Punic Wars. Rome was not a seafaring nation originally, but when faced with Carthage, the dominant maritime power, they adapted quickly. They built hundreds of ships in 2 months. To compensate for their lack of sailing skill, they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that dropped onto enemy ships, allowing their superior infantry to fight at sea. It was a clumsy solution, but it worked, allowing Rome to dominate the Mediterranean. However, not every campaign was a victory. The Romans suffered defeats that shook the empire to its core. One of the most famous was the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 years after the Common Era. The Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions, roughly 15,000 men, into the dense forests of Germania. He was lured into a trap by Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman auxilia. The Germanic terrain was a nightmare for the legions. The heavy armor and tight formations that gave them superiority on open plains became liabilities in the mud and narrow paths of the forest. The Germans used guerrilla tactics, hitting the Roman columns and melting back into the trees. For days, the Romans were harried, bogged down by storms and ambushes. The discipline began to crack. The legions were cut to pieces. Varus fell on his own sword in despair. The 3 eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, were captured. The Emperor Augustus was said to wander the palace at night, banging his head against the wall and crying, "Varus, give me back my legions!" It was a stark reminder that despite their power, the Romans were not invincible. The Teutoburg Forest effectively stopped Roman expansion into Germany, setting the border at the Rhine for the rest of their history. This adaptability to terrain was something the legions struggled with in the Far East as well. At the Battle of Carrhae against the Parthians, the Romans discovered the deadly effectiveness of mounted archers. The Parthians would feign retreat and turn in their saddles to fire arrows at the Romans, a tactic known as the Parthian shot. The Roman infantry were like sitting ducks, their heavy shields useless against the rain of arrows coming from a distance. It taught the Romans a painful lesson about the need for light cavalry and archers of their own. Despite these setbacks, the Roman legions continued to dominate for centuries. They learned from their defeats. They integrated more cavalry, including Sarmatian cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry that would eventually evolve into the knights of the Middle Ages. They modified their equipment, switching to longer swords called spathas in the later empire, and adopting oval shields to better defend against the slashing attacks of barbarian cavalry. In the late Empire, the legions changed again. The army was split into limitanii, border troops who garrisoned the frontiers, and comitatenses, mobile field armies that could rush to crisis points. The quality of the training and equipment declined as the empire's economy struggled, but the legacy of the legion remained. The very word legion continued to strike fear into the hearts of enemies. The psychological impact of the legions cannot be overstated. To be a Roman soldier was to be part of something larger than yourself. You were a citizen of the world, bringing civilization in the form of law, order, and concrete to the barbarians. Or at least, that is what they told themselves. In reality, they were often the bringers of death and destruction, wiping out cultures and enslaving populations. But for the soldier in the ranks, the war was personal. He fought for the man next to him. The bond between soldiers in a legion was intense. They lived together, ate together, and marched together. They protected one another in the testudo formation when arrows rained down from the sky, locking their shields together to create a shell of overlapping iron. In that moment, the safety of the individual depended entirely on the discipline of the group. This camaraderie is what made the legion so dangerous. An enemy might break and run when faced with a determined charge, but the Romans would stand and fight to the last man if ordered to do so. It was a bravery born of training and trust. As we look back at the ruins of Roman forts that dot the landscape of Europe, from Hadrian's Wall in the north of England to the deserts of Syria, we can still feel the presence of these men. They are the ghosts of empire. Men who left their homes in Italy, Gaul, Spain, or Africa to die in a foreign land for a standard made of gold and silver. The legions were the blood that pumped through the arteries of the empire. When they were strong, Rome was strong. When they became weak or politicized, Rome fell. They were the true founders of the empire, not the emperors or the senators. It was the legionaries' boot that stamped the face of the ancient world and left an imprint that is still visible today. Which Roman general or battle do you find the most fascinating? Is it the tactical brilliance of Scipio Africanus, the ruthless ambition of Julius Caesar, or the desperate defense of Masada? We want to know your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below. Before we conclude, let's consider the ultimate fate of the legionary. When his 25 years of service were up, he was discharged. He received a diploma, a bronze certificate granting him citizenship if he didn't have it already, and land or a cash payment. He was expected to settle near his legion's base, often founding a colony of veterans. These colonies became the seedbeds of Roman culture in the provinces. In this way, the soldiers didn't just conquer the land, they populated it. They married local women, built farms, and became the new local aristocracy. The legacy of the legions is not just in their conquests, but in the order they imposed. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, allowed trade to flourish, ideas to spread, and infrastructure to be built. It was a peace enforced by the sword, but it was a peace that lasted for 200 years. Even after the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the memory of the legions lived on. Charlemagne and later medieval kings tried to recreate the discipline of the Roman armies. In the Renaissance, generals studied Roman military treatises like those of Vegetius. Even today, military organizations around the world use structures and ranks that have their roots in the Roman legions. The story of the legions is a story of human potential pushed to its absolute limit. It is about what men can achieve when they submit to a system and work together toward a common goal, however brutal that goal may be. It is a testament to the power of discipline, training, and engineering. As the sun sets over the ruins of the Colosseum, where the victories of the legions were once celebrated, we can imagine the sound of the horns fading away. The boots are silent now. The rust has eaten the pila, but the history remains. It is a story of iron, blood, and glory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the Roman war machine. We hope you have enjoyed this look at the men who forged an empire. If you found this audiobook insightful, please leave a like and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. We want to leave you with one final question today. What do you think is the greatest military legacy left by the Roman legions? Was it their tactics, their engineering, or their concept of citizenship? Leave a comment below with your answer. This has been Legions of Rome, War, Conquest, and Glory. I am Alex. Until next time, remember that history is not just about what happened. It is about who made it happen.